with our stories. So our next storyteller is another person who I have had the honor of having at El Dorado Nature Center on many different occasions. And he's here tonight, and he is one of the most honest storytellers I've ever met. Yeah. And he's also been telling stories since the day he was born. So please welcome Padraic Keohane.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks. Before I start my story, I actually wanted to say Linda's story reminded me of the pies for Thanksgiving my grandmother used to make. It was like apple pies, different ones, but the crust was very high. It would always be these giant bumps in the crust itself, and I always loved those. And every year my father loves to tell the story of how one of his brothers cut open the crust, took the crust off, ate all the apple pie filling, and put the crust back on. So when they came later after dinner and they cut into it, it just collapsed. And my father said, well, I've heard of people taking the cake, but never of someone taking the pie. And that's one of his favorite Thanksgiving things. But my story has nothing to do with any of that. So my story takes place in Ireland, in the town of Inishowen. And it deals with Pat Diver. And Pat Diver was a tinker. Basically, he went around and he fixed things. And he would often travel through towns, fixing things like pots, kettles, things along those lines. And there was a fair in Inishowen, and he was there to offer his services. And it was actually a fairly good day for him. And he actually made a few pennies and so. But at the end of the night, it started to get dark, and he didn't have a place to stay. So he went to some of the inns, and none of them had a room. Well, that wasn't too bad. There were a lot of homes, and so he started going from house to house, seeing if anybody had a room that he could spend the night in. But nobody seemed to, and he was going down the street, and finally he came to the very last house. And he knocked on the door, and he saw inside there was a man and a woman sitting by a fire, older man, older woman sitting in front of a fire. And they said, what do you want? And he said, well, I'm looking for a room so I can spend the night. And he jiggled the pennies he had in his pocket to show he had some money in case they asked for it. And the old man looked at him and said, well, can you tell a story? And Pat was taken aback by this, and he thought, well, no, not really. I've never been good at telling stories. And the old man said, well, get on with you then. Only those that can tell a story will stay here tonight. What was he to do? The man seemed pretty adamant. Pat just mumbled to himself, telling stories like you do to little children. Huh. And he wandered away. But he did notice that there was a barn behind the house. And he thought, that's a nice place to spend the night. As long as they have a hayloft with some hay, he could crawl in there. So Pat went into the barn. He found the hayloft, buried himself within the hay, went to sleep. He wasn't sleeping long, though, because he heard the door open, and he peered through the hay. And he saw 4 very large gentlemen walking in. And one of them had a dead body on its back. Now, they threw the body on the ground, and they tied a rope to the feet. They threw the rope over the rafters, and they pulled the body up. Then they started a fire beneath it. And one of the 4 was turning the body over the fire. Now, as he's doing this, he gets a little tired, and he says to the tallest one, I'm tired turning this body. Why don't you take your turn and turn the body for a while? And the tallest one says, faith and troth, I'll not turn the body. Why don't we ask Pat Diver there in the hay to come out and take his turn with the body? So they said, Pat Diver, come out here and take your turn turning the body over the fire. What was he to do? He crawled out of the hay, and he went and he started to turn this body over the fire. And the biggest one said, now make sure you turn it and cook it well, Pat. Because if it burns, we're tying you up there next. And then they left. So Pat was just doing his best to turn this body over the fire. Now, he was so scared he didn't notice that the flames had actually started to burn through the rope. And the body fell directly into the fire. And Pat screamed, he grabbed his items, he ran out of the barn, ran down the road as fast and as far as he could. After he couldn't breathe anymore, he was out of breath, he stopped, he looked around, and he saw that next to the side of the road there was a ditch with some tall grass. And he thought, well, that's as good a place as any to spend the night. And so he crawled down into the ditch, into the grass, and he went to sleep. However, he wasn't sleeping very long when he was woken by the sound of footsteps coming up the road. And so he peered through the grass, and what did he see? He saw the 4 large men coming up the road, one of them holding the body on his back. Now, as they're walking past, the one with the body turns to the tallest one and says, "I'm tired carrying this body around. Why don't you take your turn and carry the body for a while?" And the tallest one says, "Faith and troth, I'll not take a turn. We should ask Pat Diver there in the ditch to come up and take his turn." So the 4 of them say, Pat Diver, come up, take your turn carrying the body." What was he to do? Pat got out of the ditch, dusted himself off, took the body, and started to follow the 4 gentlemen. Now they walked for a very long time. Eventually, they came to an old churchyard, and the 4 of them went in with Pat behind. And as soon as they went in, they started to dig a grave in the graveyard. Now, as they were digging, Pat put down the body, and he climbed into a nearby tree and tried to hide himself in the branches. After a while, though, one of the ones who was digging turned to the tallest one and said, "You know, I am tired digging this grave. Why don't you take your turn and dig the grave for a while?" And the tallest one said, "Faith and troth, I'll not take a turn. We should ask Pat Diver there in the tree to come down and take his turn." And so the 4 of them turned to the tree and say, Pat Diver, come down, take your turn digging this grave." What was he to do? Pat came down, grabbed a shovel, and he started to dig the grave. Now, after a few minutes there, a cock crowed in the distance. Once the cock crowed, the 4 men looked at each other. And then the tallest one said, "Lucky for you, Pat, that the cock crowed. For if it didn't, we would have been burying you with the body." And then they all 4 disappeared. Now, time went on, and Pat was once again at a fair and in a showing. And he was walking through the crowds when he bumped into a very, very large man. And the man said, "How you doing, Pat?" And Pat Diver looked at him and said, "I'm sorry, sir, you have me at a disadvantage. I don't think I know who you are." And the man said, "Don't you remember me, Pat? Well, let's put it this way. Next time you need a room for the night and in a showing, oh, you'll have a story to tell him." And that's the story known as Far Darig in Donegal.
Thank you, Patrick.